At exactly 2:27 in the cold morning, the harsh ring of my phone shattered the silence of my bedroom. I reached for it blindly, expecting an emergency call from my overseas acquisitions team. Instead, the caller ID showed my father's name. When I answered, Winston's voice was not the booming, authoritative baritone that had commanded boardrooms and Sunday church services my entire life. It was a fragile, trembling whisper. "Sienna, honey, I am at the police station. Your brother's wife beat me with a baseball bat. But she told the police I attacked her because I am mentally ill. Your brother just stood by and let it happen." My blood ran cold, but the icy calm that made me a feared corporate raider instantly took over. I threw a silk trench coat over my pajamas, grabbed my keys, and drove my Porsche through the empty streets of Atlanta toward the Buckhead precinct. I am Sienna, 33 years old, and for my entire life, my family treated me like an invisible disappointment. Tonight, they would all finally learn exactly who they were really messing with. The fluorescent lights of the police precinct buzzed overhead as I pushed through the heavy double doors. The scene playing out in the lobby was sickeningly theatrical. Eleanor, my brother's pale blonde wife, sat wrapped in a police blanket, sobbing hysterically into her manicured hands. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime, trembling like a fragile leaf, while a sympathetic desk sergeant handed her a cup of water. Standing right beside her, rubbing her shoulders, was my older brother Marcus, the golden child. The son who had been handed Ivy League tuition's luxury cars and endless bailouts while I was left to pay for my own state college tuition by working double shifts. Across the room, my father sat handcuffed to a metal bench. His lip was bleeding and his eyes carried a look of utter broken betrayal as he stared at the son he had worshipped for 35 years. "Sign the psychiatric hold, Marcus." Eleanor wept loudly, making sure every officer in the room could hear her. "He has lost his mind. He came at me with the bat. If you do not commit him right now, he is going to kill us." Marcus nodded vigorously, playing the part of the weary, protective husband. "I know, babe. I am signing the paperwork right now. We have to put him in a facility. It is for his own absolute good." "You are not signing anything," I said, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. Every head in the precinct turned toward me. I walked slowly across the linoleum floor, my heels clicking in a steady, ominous rhythm. Marcus rolled his eyes, his face twisting into that familiar sneer he had used since we were teenagers. "What are you doing here, Sienna? Go back to your little apartment. This is family business, and it is way above your pay grade." He turned to the desk sergeant, pointing a dismissive finger at me. "Do not listen to her, officer. She is just a low-level financial clerk. She is bitter she is single, and she has always been jealous of my marriage. I am my father's eldest son, and his legal next of kin. I am making the medical decisions here." Eleanor peeked out from under her blanket, her tear-stained face twisting into a malicious smirk. "Sienna, please leave. Your father is dangerous. We are the victims here." I ignored her entirely and walked straight toward the young, aggressive-looking patrol officer who was moving to pull my father up from the bench by his handcuffs. "Take those cuffs off my father right now," I commanded softly. The officer puffed out his chest, stepping into my personal space. "Ma'am, step back. This man violently assaulted his son's wife. He is going to county jail, and then he is going to a psychiatric ward." I did not back down. I tilted my head, reading the silver nameplate on his uniform. "Officer Davis, you must be new to the Buckhead precinct. Let me give you a quick lesson in local economics. You think I am a financial clerk because my brother is a delusional narcissist who has not bothered to ask about my life in a decade. I am the chief executive officer of Vanguard Capital. We are the hedge fund that just bought out the municipal debt for the entire city of Atlanta, including the severely underfunded police pension program that guarantees your retirement. If you do not take those handcuffs off my father in the next 5 seconds, I will personally see to it that your union representatives are fielding calls from my legal team by sunrise." Officer Davis froze. The color drained completely from his face. He looked at me, then at my trench coat, then down at the custom diamond-encrusted watch on my wrist that cost more than his house. He stammered, stepping backward. "Ma'am, I did not realize—" The precinct captain, who had been watching from his glass office, rushed out, his face pale with sudden recognition. "Miss Sienna, please accept my deepest apologies. Davis, remove those cuffs immediately." As the precinct captain scrambled to unlock my father's wrists, my brother Marcus turned absolutely purple with blinding rage. "This is insane! You cannot listen to her! My father is a violent lunatic and I demand he be committed immediately!" Marcus screamed loudly at everyone, slamming his fist on the front desk. I smiled coldly, reaching into my coat pocket. I pulled out a small silver USB drive and plugged it directly into the precinct's main presentation monitor on the wall. "The luxury mansion you and Eleanor live in?" I asked, watching their confused expressions. "I own it, and I installed hidden 4K security cameras to ensure my father's safety. Let us all watch the screen and see exactly who the real violent lunatic in this family truly is." The absolute silence in the precinct lasted exactly 3 seconds before sheer chaos erupted. The desk sergeant dropped his pen, and Officer Davis, desperately trying to salvage his career and his pension, immediately unclipped his handcuffs. He turned his back on my father and marched straight toward the waiting area where Eleanor sat. The fake tears on my sister-in-law's face instantly evaporated, replaced by genuine, unadulterated panic. She threw the police blanket off her shoulders and scrambled backward against the plastic chairs. She screamed for Marcus to do something as Officer Davis grabbed her wrist, loudly reciting her Miranda rights. He informed her she was being placed under arrest for filing a false police report, aggravated assault, and obstruction of justice. My father rubbed his bruised wrists, standing up slowly as he watched his daughter-in-law thrash against the police officer. Marcus lunged forward, trying to wedge his body between his wife and the arresting officer, begging them to stop, and claiming the video was somehow taken out of context. I stood perfectly still, watching the very people who had tried to destroy my father crumble under the weight of their own arrogance. I wanted them to feel every second of this humiliation. I wanted them to finally realize that their actions had severe, inescapable consequences. Before the heavy metal cuffs could click closed around Eleanor's wrists, the precinct doors burst open with a deafening crash. A wave of freezing night air swept through the lobby, followed immediately by a team of men in immaculate, custom-tailored suits. Leading the pack was Harrison Sterling, Eleanor's father, alongside his wife Victoria. The Sterlings were the epitome of buckhead old money. They were a powerful, generational white real estate family who treated the city of Atlanta like their own personal chessboard. Flanking them were 3 elite defense attorneys carrying leather briefcases and expressions of absolute disdain. Harrison did not even bother looking at me or my father. He marched directly toward the precinct captain's glass office, his voice booming with the entitled fury of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He demanded that his daughter be released immediately. He threatened to call the mayor, the governor, and the chief of police, loudly reminding the captain exactly how much the Sterling family had donated to the Police Benevolent Fund last quarter. The captain stepped out of his office, sweating profusely, caught between a billionaire real estate tycoon and the hedge fund chief executive who owned his retirement pension. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife as the two vastly different worlds collided in the middle of a police station. The lead defense attorney stepped right between Officer Davis and Eleanor, physically blocking the arrest with his body. He pointed a manicured finger at the monitor, where my security footage was still paused, on Eleanor holding the baseball bat. The lawyer smoothly declared that the video was a malicious, fabricated deepfake. He looked around the room with practiced theatricality and stated that Sienna Washington, a notoriously cutthroat corporate raider, had clearly used artificial intelligence to manipulate the footage out of pure, unhinged jealousy. Victoria Sterling sneered at me, looking me up and down like I was something disgusting she had scraped off her designer shoe. She told the captain that I was simply a bitter, unmarried woman who was obsessed with her daughter's perfect life and perfect marriage. She claimed I was trying to frame Eleanor to steal away my brother's attention. Instead of defending his own flesh and blood, Marcus aggressively sided with his wealthy in-laws. He stepped away from my father and stood shoulder to shoulder with the Sterlings. He glared at me, his face twisted with intense hatred, and yelled that I was an absolute embarrassment to our family name. He shouted that I had spent my entire life trying to ruin his happiness because no man would ever want to deal with a woman as cold and calculating as me. My father watched his only son side with the exact same people trying to lock him in a psychiatric ward, and the heartbreak in his tired eyes was almost too much to bear. I did not raise my voice or let their pathetic insults break my composure. I knew exactly how to handle people who thought their wealth made them untouchable. I smoothed the lapel of my trench coat and stepped closer to the angry group and simply asked Harrison Sterling a very logical question. I asked him why a billionaire real estate mogul was in such a desperate, frantic rush to have a retired 68-year-old black man committed to a psychiatric facility at 3 a.m. Harrison's face turned violently red. The veins in his neck bulged as he lost whatever shred of diplomatic control he had left. He took a highly threatening step toward me, jabbing his finger in the air. He yelled that he did not have time to play stupid games with a brat like me, because Winston's mental health evaluation was already finalized, signed, and processed for tomorrow's merger. The entire room seemed to hold its breath once again, but my analytical mind was already racing 1,000,000 miles a minute. My eyes narrowed as I locked onto his panicked, furious expression, instantly catching the fatal slip of the tongue. I stared directly into Harrison's widening eyes as the heavy silence returned to the precinct. I tilted my head, letting the weight of his own words crush the remaining arrogance out of the room. Exactly what merger? The question hung in the stale precinct air, like a lit match over a puddle of gasoline. Harrison Sterling snapped his mouth shut, suddenly realizing the catastrophic mistake he had just made in front of police officers and defense attorneys. The color drained from his weathered face as he looked at his son-in-law for help. Marcus mirrored his panic, his eyes darting frantically toward the precinct captain's glass office before settling back on my unyielding stare. My brother grabbed me by the elbow and dragged me out of the main lobby, pushing through a heavy wooden door into a deserted, dimly lit hallway near the holding cells. He slammed the door behind us, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to regain control of the crumbling narrative. I yanked my arm away from his aggressive grip, brushing off my silk trench coat with deliberate slowness. I looked him dead in the eye and told him he had exactly 1 minute to explain what Harrison meant by a merger, or I was going to call the authorities and have his accounts audited by sunrise. Marcus let out a bitter laugh that echoed off the cold cinder-block walls. He ran a trembling hand over his face, finally dropping the pathetic facade of the terrified, protective son he had been playing all night. He stepped into my personal space, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me the same way he had done when we were angry children. He told me I had no idea how the real world worked because I was too busy playing pretend in my corporate office downtown. I looked up at the arrogant man who had been handed the keys to our family kingdom on a silver platter. While I was taking out high-interest loans and working graveyard shifts to pay for my state college tuition, he was eagerly writing 6-figure checks to cover Marcus's Ivy League expenses and his endless string of failed startup companies. Marcus sneered, telling me that I was always destined to be the scapegoat, the bitter second choice who had to scratch and claw for everything, while he was born to effortlessly rule the family legacy. He leaned in uncomfortably close, his breath reeking of expensive scotch and undeniable desperation. He admitted that the family legacy was completely broke. He confessed that he had secretly accrued over $10 million in underground gambling debts, and the ruthless people he owed were threatening to break his legs if he did not pay up by the end of the month. I stared at him in absolute disgust. Our father had worked 50 grueling years to build his real estate portfolio, and Marcus was willing to throw him into a psychiatric ward just to cover his own pathetic mistakes. Marcus gloated about his sinister plan without an ounce of genuine remorse. He revealed that our father was sitting on a $50 million commercial land trust right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. It was a prime, highly coveted piece of real estate that the Sterling family had been ruthlessly trying to acquire for over a decade. Marcus laughed, explaining that Winston would never willingly sell the property to the Sterlings because he knew they were gentrifying vultures who simply wanted to bulldoze the historic neighborhood. Marcus made a devastating deal with his wealthy white-in-laws behind everyone's back. If he helped Eleanor and her parents have Winston declared legally incompetent, Marcus would seize control of the massive trust as the eldest male heir. Once he had the power of attorney, he would sell the $50 million land trust to Harrison Sterling for mere pennies on the dollar. In exchange for this ultimate betrayal, Harrison would secretly pay off Marcus's massive gambling debts and give him a prestigious seat on the board of their corporate real estate empire. He called it a flawless, victimless crime. He justified his horrific betrayal by claiming that our father was getting old anyway, and the vast amount of money was much better utilized by the son who actually knew how to navigate the elite circles of Atlanta. I felt a pure rage burn fiercely through my veins. He conspired with the very people who constantly looked down on our family, willingly trading his own father's freedom to save his own skin. I told Marcus that his flawless plan was over now. I promised him that I would drag him and his deceptive wife through every civil and criminal court in the state of Georgia until they had absolutely nothing left. I turned my back on my cowardly brother, reaching for the heavy door handle to go back into the main lobby, and immediately informed the precinct captain about the fraudulent land deal. Before my fingers could even touch the cold metal, the door swung open forcefully from the other side. Harrison Sterling stepped into the dim hallway, his earlier panic replaced by a smug, victorious smile that made my stomach churn. He adjusted his expensive designer tie and pulled a folded piece of crisp paper from his suit jacket pocket. He held it out to me, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. I slowly took the document, scanning the bold legal print at the top of the page. It was an official court order, signed late in the night by a local judge who was notoriously close with the powerful Sterling family. Harrison chuckled darkly, leaning casually against the doorframe as he watched me read the devastating words. He smoothly informed me that a corrupt judge had just officially approved a 48-hour emergency conservatorship based entirely on Eleanor's fabricated assault claims and a falsified medical report. Marcus stepped up right beside his father-in-law, a wicked, triumphant grin spreading across his face. He crossed his arms over his chest and proudly announced that as of exactly 5 minutes ago, he legally controlled every single aspect of Winston's entire life. The sheer audacity of Marcus's declaration hung heavily in the narrow corridor. Before I could even summon the words to rip his pathetic delusion apart, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. He glanced at the screen, and his wicked smile widened into a full, toothy grin. He looked at my father, who was leaning heavily against the cinder-block wall, looking older and more fragile than I had ever seen him. Marcus casually announced that he had just authorized a private security firm to raid our father's primary estate. He had already dispatched a team of armed guards to physically change the locks on the heavy iron gates of the property. With a few taps on his screen, my brother had completely frozen every single one of Winston's personal checking and savings accounts. He effectively stripped a proud, hard-working man of his entire life savings in a matter of seconds. Harrison Sterling clapped my brother on the shoulder, congratulating him on a job well done. The billionaire real estate mogul warned me to stay out of their way, claiming that any interference with a court-ordered conservatorship would result in my immediate arrest. They turned their backs on us and walked back into the main lobby, leaving my father completely destitute and entirely dependent on the very son who had just betrayed him to a family of corporate vultures. I did not waste my breath screaming at their retreating figures. I gently took my father by the arm, guiding him away from the damp, oppressive walls of the police precinct. I drove him straight to my multi-level penthouse in the heart of downtown Atlanta. The ride was completely silent. Winston stared blankly out the passenger window, his hands trembling slightly in his lap as he watched the city lights blur past. He was a man who had survived poverty, systemic racism, and the ruthless, cutthroat nature of the commercial real estate market, only to be entirely broken by the greed of his own flesh and blood. When we arrived at my secure building, my private security team immediately escorted us up to the top floor. I settled him into my guest suite, wrapping a heavy cashmere blanket around his shoulders. He looked up at me, tears welling in his tired eyes, and whispered that he did not understand how the boy he raised could become such a monster. I sat on the edge of the bed and held his calloused hands. I promised him that Marcus would not get away with this. I swore to my father that I would tear down the entire Sterling family empire, brick by brick, until they had absolutely nothing left. As soon as I closed the guest room door to let my father sleep, my personal cell phone vibrated violently in my coat pocket. A rapid succession of text messages flooded my illuminated screen. They were from Eleanor. My sister-in-law apparently felt emboldened by her father's corrupt legal victory and wanted to gloat. The first message was a high-definition photograph of my father's cherished leather armchair, sitting at the bottom of a filthy, rain-soaked dumpster. The second photo showed two burly, unsmiling private security guards aggressively tossing my mother's vintage photo albums into the back of a garbage truck. My chest tightened with a searing white-hot fury as I swiped through the horrific images. Eleanor then sent a long, venomous paragraph dripping with racial undertones and arrogant, misplaced superiority. She typed that she was finally clearing out the trash from her new family property. She mockingly told me not to bother fighting the court order because the Sterling family owned the judges, the police, and the entire city. She ended her disgusting rant by telling me to go back to my boring desk job because I was just a little girl playing with spreadsheets, and I was vastly unequipped to go to war with real generational wealth. I stood in the center of my darkened living room, the glowing screen of my phone casting a cold light across my face. I read Eleanor's final, arrogant sentence 3 times. She actually believed that because her family name carried weight in the exclusive elitist country clubs of Buckhead, she was somehow invincible. She completely underestimated the sheer brutal magnitude of the financial power I wielded on a daily basis. I did not throw my phone. I did not cry. I did not scream into the empty penthouse. Instead, a dangerous, predatory calm washed over my entire body. I walked over to the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering Atlanta skyline. I looked down at the towering skyscrapers and bustling financial districts that I practically owned. I walked to my sleek glass desk and opened my encrypted corporate laptop. I bypassed 3 separate layers of biometric security to access the restricted global acquisition dashboard for Vanguard Capital. The Sterling family thought they were playing a local game of real estate monopoly. They had absolutely no idea that I controlled the very banking institutions that held their precious over-leveraged mortgages. I picked up my secure satellite phone and dialed the direct unlisted number for my head of acquisitions. The phone rang only once before my lead financial shark answered, waiting for my command. I instructed him to mobilize the entire nighttime trading desk immediately. I told him to initiate a ruthless, unmitigated hostile takeover of Sterling Holdings. I ordered my team to quietly buy up every single ounce of their corporate debt from every major bank in the country. All of it. I hung up the receiver and stared out at the sprawling city below me, feeling the raw adrenaline pump through my veins. Marcus and Eleanor wanted to destroy my father for a pathetic piece of downtown real estate. By the time the sun came up tomorrow morning, their entire generational legacy would officially belong to me. They were done, and they did not even know it. The sun rose over Atlanta the next morning, casting a warm, golden glow across the sprawling, meticulously manicured greens of the historic Piedmont Country Club. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the grand ballroom was packed with the city's most elite socialites, influential politicians, and ruthless real estate moguls. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the distinct, arrogant confidence of old money families celebrating another unearned financial victory. Harrison Sterling spared no expense to celebrate. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos glided through the crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of expensive champagne and imported caviar. At the center of the room, sitting at a massive reserved table adorned with cascading white orchids, was my brother, Marcus. He was holding court like a conquering king. He wore a tailored suit he undoubtedly bought on credit, laughing loudly and accepting eager handshakes from wealthy men who had spent decades looking down on our father. Eleanor sat elegantly by his side, glowing with the smug satisfaction of a woman who believed she had just orchestrated the perfect crime. They were openly celebrating the hostile acquisition of Winston's $50 million commercial land trust, framing it to the elite crowd as a brilliant joint venture between two powerful families. They were toasting to my father's demise, completely unaware of the financial execution I had initiated just hours ago. I did not bother with an invitation, and I certainly did not wait in line at the front entrance. I walked through the mahogany doors, wearing a crimson pantsuit that commanded absolute attention. My heels struck the polished marble floor with a rhythmic echoing intensity that instantly cut through the loud chatter of the room. Heads turned, one by one. The lively conversations slowly died out, replaced by a ripple of uncomfortable whispers as the guests recognized the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The string quartet playing softly in the corner faltered and halted. I kept my gaze locked entirely on the center table. I watched the arrogant, joyful smile absolutely melt off my brother's face the second he spotted me walking toward him. Marcus slammed his crystal champagne flute down on the table, spilling the expensive liquid across the pristine white linen tablecloth. He shot up from his chair, his face contorting into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Eleanor gasped, instinctively grabbing her father's arm, as Harrison Sterling turned his chair around to glare at me with seething hatred. Marcus marched directly toward the center of the ballroom to intercept me, ensuring that every single important guest in the room had a front-row seat to his performance. He threw his arms out wide and shouted, "How did you manage to sneak past the front gate?" He turned to the crowd and dramatically apologized for the interruption, pointing a finger at me. "This is my bitter, unmarried sister. She is a total failure who simply cannot handle seeing her older brother succeed." He projected his voice so the politicians and investors could hear every single cruel word. He declared I was a jealous outcast, throwing a tantrum because our father had finally chosen to pass his legacy down to his capable son. He laughed mockingly, telling the crowd I was just a lowly spreadsheet reader, desperate for attention because I had no husband, no family, and absolutely no class. Eleanor chimed in from the table, raising her voice to call me an embarrassment to the Washington name. Leave, before you make a bigger fool of yourself in front of Atlanta's most respected families. Marcus crossed his arms over his chest, puffed out his shoulders, and snapped his fingers toward the large double doors, where 4 burly country club security guards were standing at attention. He pointed at the heavy doors and the imposing guards and loudly commanded, "Grab her right now and throw her completely out into the parking lot!" He yelled at them to use physical force if necessary, claiming I was trespassing on a private, exclusive event and threatening the safety of his highly distinguished guests. I did not flinch. I certainly did not take a single step backward. I stood in the center of the silent ballroom, a relaxed, predatory smile curving the corners of my mouth. Marcus barked the order a second time, his voice cracking with intense frustration when the 4 massive security guards remained perfectly still, like statues carved out of solid stone. They did not even blink in his direction. The absolute confusion on my brother's face was a brilliant masterpiece. He yelled at the guards again, demanding to know if they were deaf and threatening to have them permanently fired before the afternoon was over. Before Marcus could scream a 4th time, the general manager of the Piedmont Country Club practically sprinted across the ballroom. He was a highly distinguished older man in a custom-tailored suit, but right now he was sweating profusely and physically shaking as he approached the center table. He bypassed Marcus entirely and leaned down to whisper frantically into Harrison Sterling's ear. Harrison's face drained of all color, turning an ashy, sickly shade of gray. Marcus grabbed the manager by the shoulder and demanded to know why the security team was refusing to follow his direct orders. The manager swallowed hard, his voice trembling as it carried across the silent room. He looked at Marcus with a mixture of pity and sheer terror. He nervously stammered out the devastating truth, informing my brother that the security guards could not remove me from the premises because they no longer worked for the Sterling family. As of 8 o'clock this very morning, Vanguard Capital has officially finalized a swift cash purchase of the entire hospitality conglomerate that owns this country club, the manager explained. The security guards work for her now. I stepped around my paralyzed brother, walked directly to the front podium, and took the microphone firmly in my right hand. I tapped the microphone twice, the sharp thud reverberating through the massive speakers and freezing the remaining murmurs in the grand ballroom. I looked out over the sea of Atlanta's most influential politicians, wealthy socialites, and ruthless real estate moguls. They were staring at me with a mixture of absolute shock and morbid curiosity, completely bewildered by the sudden shift in power taking place before their very eyes. I smiled warmly and welcomed the elite guests to my newly acquired property. I clearly told the crowd that my brother Marcus had just given a beautiful, heartfelt speech about preserving family legacy. But he had conveniently left out the most important financial details. I gestured to the audiovisual technician standing nervously near the soundboard at the back of the room. I had paid him a very generous cash bonus earlier that morning to bypass the country club's standard presentation software and sync his system directly to my secured tablet. The massive projector screens behind the center table flickered to life. Instead of the planned slideshow displaying my father's stolen land trust development, the screens illuminated with highly classified, meticulously documented bank statements. The collective gasp from the wealthy audience was absolute music to my ears. I knew I had their complete and undivided attention. I directed the crowd's attention to the towering screens projecting my voice with crystal-clear authority. I broke down the exact anatomy of Marcus's so-called brilliant business career. I showed them the raw financial data from his last 3 startup companies, revealing exactly how each one had plummeted into complete, devastating bankruptcy within 18 months of operation. I highlighted the millions of dollars our father Winston had secretly bled from his own retirement accounts to quietly settle Marcus's corporate lawsuits and keep him out of a federal prison cell. The numbers did not lie, and they painted a highly pathetic picture of a spoiled, incompetent man playing pretend in the cutthroat corporate world. But I was not finished dismantling my brother just yet. I tapped a button on my remote, and the screen shifted to display underground ledgers from 3 notorious offshore betting syndicates. I announced to the silent room that Marcus was currently drowning in $10 million of illicit gambling debt. I explained that the only reason he was celebrating the theft of our father's land trust today was because ruthless debt collectors were actively threatening his life. Marcus stood frozen in front of his prestigious guests, his face pale and dripping with cold sweat, as his carefully constructed facade of ultimate success completely disintegrated before his own eyes. Eleanor jumped out of her chair, her face contorted with unhinged, violent rage. She pointed a manicured finger at the glowing screens and shrieked that I was fabricating evidence to destroy her perfect marriage and tarnish her pristine social standing. She screamed at the audiovisual technician to turn the projectors off immediately. But he had already locked the system and quietly walked out the back doors. I shifted my gaze to my sister-in-law, my calm expression turning into a sharp, predatory grin. I pressed the remote again, and the screen rapidly transitioned to display sealed court records from a specific legal jurisdiction in Florida. I smoothly informed the high society crowd that Eleanor was not the flawless, elegant Southern heiress she pretended to be. I exposed her buried criminal history, detailing a highly sophisticated insurance fraud scheme she had personally orchestrated 7 years ago. The documents proved beyond any reasonable doubt that she had deliberately set fire to a luxury yacht to collect a massive multi-million-dollar payout. The records also showed how her billionaire father had blatantly bribed a local judge to expunge the felony conviction from her public record. The whispers in the ballroom escalated into loud, scandalized murmurs. Wealthy matriarchs covered their mouths in genuine shock, while prominent investors instinctively stepped away from the Sterling family table to aggressively distance themselves from the radioactive scandal unfolding in front of them. Eleanor completely lost whatever remaining shred of diplomatic control she possessed. She lunged forward, restrained only by Marcus grabbing her waist and pulling her back against his chest. She screamed that I was a pathetic, jealous liar who would pay dearly for this public humiliation. Harrison Sterling stood up aggressively, knocking his heavy wooden chair backward onto the polished marble floor. He shouted over the rising noise of the crowd, his voice booming with entitled fury and unchecked arrogance. He threatened to unleash his elite team of corporate lawyers to completely dismantle my personal and professional life. He vowed that the Sterling family wealth was vast, ancient, and utterly untouchable by someone like me. He declared that his real estate empire would crush Vanguard Capital into dust, and he would personally ensure that I never worked in the financial sector again. I listened to his pathetic, desperate threats without breaking eye contact or showing a single ounce of fear. I calmly walked over to a passing waiter, picked up a crystal flute of vintage champagne, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The crisp liquid felt like absolute victory. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch across the room, forcing Harrison to realize his threats meant absolutely nothing to me. I lowered the glass and leaned back into the microphone, my voice echoing with undeniable authority. I informed Harrison that he could not crush me with his family wealth because that wealth no longer existed. I revealed that Vanguard Capital did not just buy the country club this morning. We had spent the entire night quietly and aggressively purchasing the entire debt portfolio of Sterling Holdings from every single major international bank on the continent. I smiled sweetly at the paralyzed billionaire and delivered the final devastating blow. I told him that I was now his biggest creditor, and I was calling in all his outstanding loans immediately, leaving his family with absolutely nothing but total financial ruin. Harrison Sterling stared at me as if I had spoken an incomprehensible alien language. For a fraction of a second, the bustling atmosphere of the Piedmont Country Club completely vanished, replaced by a suffocating vacuum of pure shock. The billionaire real estate tycoon blinked rapidly, his mind desperately struggling to process the catastrophic reality I had just dropped onto his lap. He shook his head with aggressive denial, sputtering aloud that such a financial maneuver was absolutely impossible. He claimed his banking relationships spanned decades, and no legitimate institution would ever sell his corporate debt without his explicit consent. I maintained my relaxed posture, swirling the champagne in my crystal flute. I calmly informed him that loyalty in the financial sector lasted only until a more lucrative offer was placed on the table, and my hedge fund made an offer his bankers could not refuse. Harrison snatched his custom smartphone from the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. His hands trembled so violently he nearly dropped the expensive device onto the marble floor. He dialed his primary wealth manager on speakerphone, his face turning an unhealthy shade of crimson. The phone rang 3 times before an anxious voice answered. Harrison barked a ruthless command, demanding to know the immediate status of the Sterling Holdings credit lines. The wealth manager hesitated, his voice cracking with terror as he delivered the fatal blow. He told Harrison every corporate account, offshore trust, and emergency credit line associated with the Sterling family had been frozen by the acquiring entity. He confirmed Vanguard Capital legally absorbed 94% of their outstanding debt, and the remaining lenders panicked and locked their accounts. Harrison ended the call, his chest heaving as the crushing reality of his total financial annihilation finally set in. Victoria Sterling let out a strangled gasp, collapsing backward into her dining chair. She clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes darting frantically around the silent room as she realized her pristine social standing had just been violently ripped away. Harrison turned his furious gaze back to me. The veins in his forehead bulged dangerously as he stepped directly into my personal space. He raised a heavy fist, his voice vibrating with raw menace. He threatened to destroy me, physically and legally. He vowed to hire private mercenaries to hunt me down and promised to tie me up in federal litigation until I begged for mercy on the streets. He screamed he would gladly burn the entire city to the ground before he let a disrespectful upstart dictate the fate of his generational empire. I did not back away from his towering stance. I looked the ruined billionaire dead in the eyes and pulled my secure tablet from my leather portfolio. I tapped the screen exactly 3 times. I smoothly informed Harrison that threats of physical violence were a highly unimaginative response to a simple corporate transaction. I told him because his family business was incredibly overleveraged, heavily relying on borrowed money to fund their lavish lifestyle, they were uniquely vulnerable to sudden market shifts. I looked down at my tablet and smiled brightly. I announced I had officially issued an immediate margin call on all of their leveraged assets. I explained unless he could produce $60 million in liquid cash within the next 24 hours, Vanguard Capital would legally seize every single property, luxury vehicle, and corporate asset currently bearing the Sterling family name. Marcus watched this entire exchange with wide, terrified eyes. My older brother had banked his entire future, his freedom, and his massive gambling debts on the impenetrable wealth of his white in-laws. Now he was watching that exact wealth evaporate into absolute nothingness. The false confidence he had carried all afternoon shattered completely. He grabbed Eleanor by the shoulders, his voice high-pitched and desperate. He shook his wife gently, begging her to call her powerful uncles or reach out to their political connections in Washington. He pleaded with her to fix this disastrous situation before his underground creditors found out the money was gone. Marcus reminded her they had committed multiple felonies by forging the medical documents and locking our father in a conservatorship. He cried out if the Sterling money vanished, they could not afford the elite attorneys required to keep them out of a federal penitentiary. Eleanor did not offer her husband a comforting embrace. She did not shed a single tear or utter a single word of reassurance. Instead, she forcefully shoved Marcus away from her, her face twisting into a terrifying mask of pure, calculating coldness. The fragile, weeping victim from the police station was completely gone, replaced by a ruthless survivor who knew exactly how to strategically cut her losses. She reached deep into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick, folded legal document printed on heavy cardstock. She slapped the papers aggressively against Marcus's chest, forcing him to take them. She stared at the man she vowed to love and cherish, her voice completely devoid of any human emotion. She coldly informed Marcus she was not going to a federal prison for a weak, pathetic man who could not even manage his own bank accounts. She slowly pointed to the document in his trembling hands and revealed it was a highly specialized hidden clause within their ironclad prenuptial agreement. She explained she purposefully manipulated him from the very beginning. She made absolutely certain Marcus's name, and only Marcus's name, was signed on every single piece of fraudulent paperwork regarding Winston's conservatorship and the subsequent land transfer. She loudly told my brother he had taken on all the legal liability for the entire scheme. Eleanor smiled a wickedly dark, truly terrifying smile. She announced that if the federal authorities ever came knocking, the Sterling family would simply claim they were victims of his deception. She made it perfectly clear that if the ship was sinking today, Marcus was going to rot in a federal prison completely and utterly alone. The very next morning, the heavy oak doors of the courtroom seemed to rattle loudly on their brass hinges as the clinical assistant handed the thick stack of highlighted bank statements directly to the awaiting bailiff. The judge snatched the confidential documents from the bailiff's outstretched hands, his previously stoic expression transforming from mild annoyance to absolute unbridled fury in mere seconds. He adjusted his glasses and stared at the highlighted transfer of $250,000 routed from a Sterling Holdings shell corporation directly into the personal offshore account of the so-called esteemed psychiatrist sitting on the witness stand. The corrupt doctor visibly shrank in his leather chair. He stammered, pulling at his collar and looking desperately toward Harrison Sterling for a lifeline that was never going to come. The judge slammed his wooden gavel down with the force of a gunshot. He did not ask for further clarification, and he completely, blatantly ignored the frantic, sputtering objections of the Sterling family's highly paid, panicked legal team. The judge leaned over his massive wooden bench and addressed the courtroom with booming authority. He announced that the emergency conservatorship over Winston, Washington was permanently overturned, completely nullified, and struck from the legal record as a fraudulent, malicious filing. He officially restored every single legal, financial, and personal right back to my father. But the judge did not stop there. He pointed his gavel directly at the sweating psychiatrist and then at Harrison Sterling. He loudly ordered the court stenographer to meticulously forward all typed transcripts and the newly submitted financial evidence directly to the federal prosecutor's main office. He demanded an immediate, comprehensive federal investigation into the egregious medical fraud, bribery, and criminal conspiracy orchestrated by the Sterling family to steal my father's commercial land trust. The courtroom descended into absolute, unprecedented chaos. Reporters who had sneaked into the back gallery rushed the narrow aisles, aggressively shouting questions at the fleeing billionaires who were scrambling for the exits. My private security team formed a tight ring around me and my father as we calmly walked out of the double doors and into the expansive marble-lined corridor of the courthouse. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and sheer desperation. Before we could even reach the polished bank of elevators, a loud, guttural scream echoed violently off the stone walls. Marcus burst through the courtroom doors, his designer suit wrinkled and his face twisted into an unrecognizable mask of violent rage. He shoved past a bewildered reporter, knocking a camera to the ground, and lunged directly at me with outstretched hands. He bypassed my security detail in a fraction of a second and aggressively grabbed me by the shoulders of my blazer. His grip was tight, his fingernails digging painfully into my skin as he shook me. He screamed that I had maliciously destroyed his entire life and ruined his perfect reputation. He yelled that his underground creditors were going to murder him right now that the land deal was dead, and he blamed me for single-handedly dismantling the flawless family legacy he was supposedly born to inherit. He raised his fist, his eyes wide and frantic, completely losing whatever shred of sanity he had left. Before his hand could even twitch downward to strike me, a strong, unyielding force ripped him completely away from me. My father, Winston, grabbed Marcus by the tailored collar of his expensive dress shirt and violently shoved him backward against the cold marble wall. Winston did not look frail or broken anymore. The defeated, exhausted old man from the police station was completely gone, replaced by a fierce, protective patriarch who had finally woken up to the horrific truth. My father stood firmly between me and my brother, physically shielding me with his body. He pointed a steady, calloused finger directly at Marcus's heaving chest, making sure his son felt the absolute weight of his burning anger. Winston's voice was low, dangerous, and completely devoid of the unconditional love he had wasted on his son for 3 decades. He told Marcus that he was not a victim, but a pathetic, weak parasite who had selfishly tried to sell his own father's freedom to pay for his disgusting gambling habits. Winston declared loudly, ensuring every person in the hallway heard him, that I was the only true child he had left. He looked at the trembling, arrogant man he had once called his golden boy and stated that Marcus was dead to him. He commanded Marcus to never speak to me, look at me, or come near our family ever again. Marcus slowly slid down the cold marble wall, his broad chest heaving as the absolutely crushing reality of his own father's permanent, undeniable rejection finally settled deeply in. He quickly looked around the crowded hallway, desperately searching for a single friendly face, a single ally who could bail him out of this catastrophic nightmare. He spotted his wife stepping out of the courtroom. He called out to Eleanor, reaching a trembling hand toward her, begging her to call her father and fix this massive misunderstanding before the federal investigators arrived. Eleanor did not run to comfort her distressed husband. She walked slowly across the polished floor, flanked by 2 ruthless-looking divorce attorneys she had apparently kept on retainer. The fragile, innocent housewife act was permanently retired. She looked down at the pathetic, broke man sitting on the courthouse floor with a gaze so cold it could have frozen water. She slowly reached into her pristine, expensive designer handbag and deliberately pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. She dropped it unceremoniously onto Marcus's lap. She then flatly informed him that those were emergency divorce papers filed citing extreme financial deceit and criminal liability. She loudly announced to the entire stunned hallway that she was demanding full, uncontested legal custody of their young children, and she was aggressively seizing whatever remaining liquid assets he still possessed for massive punitive alimony payments. Marcus remained utterly paralyzed on the cold marble floor of the courthouse, staring blankly at the thick manila envelope resting heavily on his lap. Eleanor did not spare her husband a single backward glance. She spun around on her designer stiletto heels and marched purposefully down the long corridor flanked by her 2 aggressive divorce attorneys. Her plan was brutally calculated and incredibly fast. Within minutes of stepping out of the judicial building, Eleanor climbed into the back of her waiting town car and immediately began making frantic phone calls. She dialed her offshore wealth managers, instructing them to swiftly drain every last cent from Marcus's remaining international bank accounts. She wanted to aggressively funnel the stolen cash directly into an untraceable shell corporation registered entirely under her maiden name. She foolishly believed that throwing Marcus to the federal wolves would give her the perfect distraction to escape with millions of dollars. She assumed her swift, ruthless legal maneuvers would completely insulate her from the catastrophic fallout of the failed conservatorship scheme. She severely underestimated my reach. I stood beside my father, watching Eleanor disappear through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse lobby. While I absolutely despised my brother for his horrific betrayal, I absolutely refused to let his manipulative wife quietly escape with funds that rightfully belonged to my family. The money Marcus had hidden offshore was originally siphoned from our father's business accounts over the course of 3 deceptive years. I pulled my secure phone from my pocket and messaged my lead cybersecurity director. I ordered him to trace the exact routing numbers Eleanor was currently attempting to access. By the time I safely escorted my exhausted father back to the armored SUV waiting at the curb, my tech team had successfully intercepted the wire transfers. They temporarily froze the offshore accounts, blocking Eleanor from moving a single penny. My security director then forwarded me her current GPS location. She was sitting in the opulent, glass-walled conference room of the most expensive corporate law firm in downtown Atlanta. I kissed my father on the cheek, promised him I would handle the rest, and instructed my driver to take me directly to her lawyer's office. But I was not going to face the sterling heiress alone. As my SUV navigated the dense downtown traffic, I made a highly secure, encrypted phone call to a man named Charles Kensington. Charles was a living legend in the global financial sector. He was a former director of enforcement for the Securities and Exchange Commission who had left the federal government to become the head of forensic intelligence at Vanguard Capital. He was a tall, impeccably dressed British expatriate with silver hair, piercing ice blue eyes, and a terrifyingly precise, analytical mind. Charles did not just find hidden money. He possessed a surgical ability to completely dismantle the people who tried to hide it. When I told him where Eleanor was currently hiding, he simply replied that he would meet me in the lobby in 10 minutes. When I stepped through the revolving glass doors of the elite law firm, Charles was already waiting by the elevators, holding a thick, securely bound leather portfolio. We exchanged a silent, knowing nod. The panicked receptionist at the front desk tried to aggressively block our path, desperately claiming that Eleanor Sterling was in a highly confidential closed-door meeting with the senior partners. Charles didn't even break his perfectly measured stride. He casually handed the receptionist a glossy business card bearing the Vanguard Capital insignia and advised her in a chillingly calm British accent to step aside unless she wanted her firm to be indicted for actively harboring a federal fugitive. She instantly froze, her face turning pale as we walked straight down the plush-carpeted hallway and forcefully pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the main conference room. Eleanor sat at the head of a massive oak table, surrounded by 4 frantic wealth managers and 2 senior law partners. The first thing that caught my eye was not Eleanor's terrified expression, but the object sitting proudly in the exact center of the polished wooden table. It was her handbag. A spectacularly rare, custom-dyed matte white Himalayan Niloticus crocodile Birkin bag featuring hardware completely encrusted with 18-karat white gold and flawless diamonds. It was a notoriously exclusive status symbol that retailed for nearly $500,000 on the private market. Even in the midst of a catastrophic federal investigation, Eleanor had deliberately placed the handbag at the center of the table like a royal crown. A pathetic, subconscious attempt to assert her fabricated superiority over the working-class lawyers scrambling to save her. Her initial shock quickly morphed into a venomous, arrogant sneer. She leaned back in her plush leather chair, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. She loudly demanded to know why the building's security had allowed a disgruntled trespassing lunatic to interrupt her private legal consultation. "Call the police immediately!" Eleanor barked at her senior partners, pointing a manicured finger at me. "She is stalking me after the courthouse altercation. Have her arrested. I calmly walked into the room and closed the heavy mahogany doors behind me, locking the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. Charles Kensington stepped forward, placing his heavy leather portfolio right next to Eleanor's spectacular Birkin bag. I looked directly across the table and informed my sister-in-law that the offshore wire transfers she was desperately trying to authorize had just been permanently blocked by Vanguard Capital. Eleanor's arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered her haughty composure. She let out a sharp, condescending laugh and told me I was completely overstepping my legal boundaries. She proudly declared that her divorce proceedings granted her emergency access to marital assets, and she dared me to try and stop her from taking what was rightfully hers. She confidently boasted that the Sterling family possessed political connections that stretched all the way to the governor's mansion. My father will make sure I never see the inside of a jail cell, regardless of what happens to your pathetic, ruined brother, she sneered, her eyes gleaming with toxic entitlement. You won a minor skirmish at the police station, Sienna, but the Sterling family always wins the war. I did not raise my voice or take her bait. I simply stepped back and yielded the floor to Charles. He adjusted his silk tie, his icy blue eyes locking onto Eleanor with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a doomed insect. Mrs. Sterling, Charles began, his voice dripping with polite, aristocratic disdain. You seem to labor under the profound delusion that you are merely a naive housewife, entangled in your husband's poor decisions. Unfortunately for you, math does not possess the capacity to lie. Charles opened his leather portfolio, pulling out a stack of heavily redacted bank ledgers, stamped with the official seal of his independent forensic auditing firm. He tossed the documents onto the oak table right next to her prized handbag. My specialized investigators have spent the last 72 hours analyzing the digital ink signatures and financial routing numbers used to initially seize Winston, Washington's commercial properties, Charles explained smoothly. The audit proves beyond any reasonable doubt that you, Eleanor, personally forged your father-in-law's signature on the primary land transfer documents. You did not just manipulate Marcus into taking the fall, you physically committed the wire fraud yourself. Eleanor's face lost a fraction of its color, but she stubbornly lifted her chin. You have absolutely no physical proof linking me to those digital documents. It is entirely circumstantial, she spat aggressively. Charles offered a chilling, terrifying smile. He slowly reached out and tapped the diamond-encrusted lock of her Himalayan Birkin bag with his index finger. On the contrary, Mrs. Sterling, the proof is currently sitting right here on this table. The entire conference room went dead silent. The senior law partners exchanged nervous, confused glances. Eleanor stared at her handbag, her breathing suddenly becoming shallow. We traced the very first illicit wire transfer generated from the forged land trust, Charles stated, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. 2 days after the fraudulent signatures were submitted, a sum of exactly $485,000 was routed through a Cayman Islands shell corporation. 60 seconds later, that exact amount was wired directly to an elite underground luxury broker in Geneva. Charles pulled a glossy receipt from his folder and slid it across the table. To purchase this exact Himalayan Birkin bag, the serial number stamped on the interior leather matches the invoice perfectly. You used the initial stolen funds from a forged federal document to buy a handbag, Eleanor. And you were arrogant enough to carry the primary piece of physical damning evidence right into your lawyer's office. I watched the remaining color completely drain from Eleanor's face as the crushing, undeniable truth of her own staggering arrogance finally caught up to her. The bag she used to flaunt her superiority was the exact anchor that was going to drag her to the bottom of the ocean. I leaned across the polished table, my voice dropping to a dangerous, cold whisper. By physically forging those corporate documents and using the proceeds to purchase luxury goods across international borders, you just made yourself a direct co-conspirator in a massive money laundering operation. You are facing 20 years in federal prison for wire fraud, and your little purse is Exhibit A. The two senior law partners beside Eleanor aggressively pushed their heavy leather chairs away from the table. They were highly paid defense attorneys, but they were not fools willing to risk their lucrative careers and law licenses for a client who had just been cornered by Charles Kensington. The lead partner stood up quickly, his face flushed with panic as he packed his briefcase. He stated firmly that their firm could not legally represent anyone actively engaged in federal forgery and money laundering. He abruptly walked out of the room, followed immediately by the second partner. Eleanor was left sitting completely alone at the massive oak table, her mouth opening and closing like a fish suffocating on dry land. She looked frantically at her wealth managers, but they were already gathering their files, rushing toward the door to escape the radioactive criminal fallout. She reached out with trembling hands, clutching the handles of her Birkin bag as if the expensive leather could somehow shield her from the law. I did not stay to watch her cry. Charles and I turned our backs on the ruined woman, walked out of the heavy doors, and stepped back into the bright, unforgiving sunshine of downtown Atlanta. I pulled my phone from my trench coat pocket, dialed the direct number for the federal prosecutor, and gave him the green light to execute the warrants. Less than an hour later, unmarked black utility vehicles swarmed the towering glass skyscraper housing the main corporate headquarters of Sterling Holdings. Dozens of federal agents wearing tactical vests poured out of the vehicles and marched straight through the revolving doors of the lobby. They did not bother stopping at the reception desk to ask for permission. The agents bypassed the panicked security guards, locked down the elevators, and flooded the executive suites on the top floors. They carried heavy cardboard boxes and digital extraction tools, systematically seizing every hard drive and paper ledger in the entire building. Wealthy executives and arrogant vice presidents were forced to lop against the glass walls, humiliated, as their smartphones were confiscated and bagged for evidence. I watched the live news coverage from the leather seat of my armored SUV parked discreetly across the street. Local news helicopters were circling overhead, broadcasting the spectacular downfall of Atlanta's most notorious real estate dynasty. While federal agents tore the corporate headquarters apart, Harrison and Victoria Sterling desperately orchestrated a cowardly escape. My cybersecurity director called my encrypted line, his voice tight with urgent adrenaline. He informed me the Sterlings bypassed their frozen bank accounts, utilizing a hidden offshore cryptocurrency wallet. They successfully chartered a private jet and were speeding toward a small executive airstrip on the city outskirts. Their flight plan indicated they were fleeing to a non-extradition country before the federal warrants could be processed. I ordered my driver to turn the vehicle around and hit the gas. We sped onto the highway, weaving aggressively through the afternoon traffic toward the private airfield. I was not going to let the people who tried locking my father in a psychiatric ward dodge federal prison. I opened my laptop and pulled up the ownership structure of the private aviation company operating the runway. As my SUV crashed through the security gate of the private airfield, I saw the white Gulfstream jet idling on the tarmac. The engines were already whining loudly, preparing for immediate takeoff. Harrison and Victoria Sterling were sprinting up the metal stairs, clutching leather duffel bags stuffed with whatever remaining cash they salvaged. I did not panic. I typed a sequence of commands into my corporate dashboard and executed a hostile buyout of the aviation company's parent holding group. Within 60 seconds, I was the legal majority shareholder of the very runway they were using. I picked up my phone and dialed the air traffic control tower overlooking the tarmac. I firmly instructed the lead dispatcher to revoke flight clearance for the Gulfstream jet immediately, warning him that Vanguard Capital would liquidate his entire operation if that plane moved at all. The massive jet engine suddenly powered down into a low, defeated hum. The heavy metal door of the aircraft opened, and Harrison stepped out onto the top of the stairs. He looked frantically toward the control tower, completely confused as to why his pilot abruptly refused to fly. I stepped out of my SUV and walked slowly across the sun-baked asphalt of the runway. Harrison spotted me, his face contorting into an ugly, desperate mask of sheer panic. He gripped the metal railing, screaming that he would give me anything I wanted if I just let the plane leave the runway. He offered me commercial buildings, hidden gold reserves, and unlimited political favors. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the pathetic, broken billionaire. I informed him that his money was completely worthless to me because his entire financial empire was being dismantled by federal investigators. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second, as a convoy of police cruisers and federal vehicles sped toward our location. Victoria Sterling collapsed onto the metal stairs, sobbing uncontrollably as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated her tear-stained face. The federal agents swarmed the aircraft, aggressively pulling Harrison down the steps and slamming him against the fuselage to read him his rights. The lead prosecutor stepped out of an unmarked vehicle and walked directly over to me, holding a thick file tightly against his chest. He looked completely bewildered by what his team discovered during the corporate raid. He pulled me aside, away from the screaming Sterlings and the chaotic arrest. He lowered his voice to a serious, hushed tone. He revealed the forensic accountants had cracked the encrypted servers hidden in Harrison's private executive suite. He told me the Sterling's vicious obsession with seizing Winston's $50 million land trust had absolutely nothing to do with commercial real estate development or neighborhood gentrification. The prosecutor handed me a printed document covered in heavily redacted international routing numbers. He grimly explained that the Sterlings were entirely broke, and they desperately needed my father's specific property to build a massive, heavily fortified warehouse to launder hundreds of millions of dollars for a highly dangerous international crime syndicate. The staggering weight of the federal prosecutor's revelation hung in the humid Atlanta air as tactical teams hauled Harrison and Victoria Sterling away in heavy chains. I did not stay to watch the transport vehicles disappear. I climbed back into my armored SUV and ordered my driver to return to the penthouse immediately. My father was waiting for me, unaware that his commercial land trust was the central target of a massive international money laundering operation. When I stepped out of my private elevator into the quiet sanctuary of my living room, the news networks were already broadcasting the spectacular downfall of the Sterling Empire on every channel. Winston sat in a plush armchair, staring at the television screen with profound relief and quiet devastation. Before I could explain the sinister truth behind the conservatorship, my secure communication tablet chimed sharply from the marble kitchen island. The head of my building's security detail appeared on the screen, his expression tense and highly professional. He informed me that a frantic, disheveled man was currently fighting with the lobby guards, desperately demanding to see his father. It was Marcus. My brother had somehow managed to evade the federal sweep of his Buckhead mansion and crawled all the way to my building like a cornered rat. I looked at my father, silently asking for his permission. Winston slowly nodded, his jaw set with a newfound, unbreakable resolve. I instructed security to put Marcus in the service elevator and send him up to the penthouse. The doors of the service elevator slid open. Marcus fell into my foyer. The golden boy of the Washington family was unrecognizable. His custom suit was stained with dirt. His tie was ripped, and his leather shoes were scuffed from running through the streets. He looked pathetic. He stumbled into the living room, his eyes darting around the expansive space before landing on our father. Marcus threw himself onto the hardwood floor, crawling on his hands and knees until he reached the edge of Winston's armchair. He grasped at the fabric of my father's trousers, weeping with theatrical sobs. He begged for forgiveness, claiming that Eleanor and her terrifying parents had manipulated him into the scheme. He cried that he was a naive victim caught in a web of corporate deception. He looked up at Winston with desperate eyes and begged for a massive sum of untraceable cash. He demanded access to a private vehicle and a safe house, insisting that federal agents were going to arrest him at any moment. He expected our father to blindly open his wallet and shield him from the consequences of his actions. Winston did not reach out to comfort his weeping son. He did not offer reassurance or pull out his checkbook to finance another cowardly escape. My father stood up slowly, forcing Marcus to release his desperate grip. Winston looked down at the pathetic man crying on my floor with an expression of unyielding finality. He told Marcus that the endless bailouts were permanently finished. He stated that he had spent his entire life working to build a respectable legacy, and Marcus had willingly traded it away to a family of racist criminals just to cover his own gambling debts. Winston declared that he would rather burn his last dollar than give a penny to the son who tried to lock him inside a psychiatric ward. The rejection struck Marcus like a physical blow. He scrambled backward, his face twisting from sorrow into a mask of ugly hatred. He turned his furious gaze toward me, spitting venom and blaming my corporate interference for ruining his flawless marriage and his guaranteed inheritance. He yelled that I was a ruthless monster who enjoyed watching her own flesh and blood suffer. I stepped directly into his line of sight, towering over his crouching figure. I did not raise my voice, but every word I spoke sliced through his fragile ego with surgical precision. I reminded Marcus of every holiday dinner where he mocked my career. I recounted every time he called me a bitter clerk who played with spreadsheets while he conquered the business world. I looked down at him and laughed coldly. I told him that while he was busy kissing the boots of his wealthy white in-laws, I was building an international financial empire that literally owned the banks holding his mortgages. I dismantled his entire identity, stating that he had failed at absolutely everything he had ever touched. I made sure he understood that he was not a victim of circumstance. He was just an incompetent parasite who finally tried to bite the wrong host. Marcus pressed his back against the glass windows, realizing that his usual tactics of manipulation were completely useless. The television behind me flashed a breaking news alert showing federal agents carrying boxes of evidence out of his own home. The panic in his eyes reached a fever pitch as the inescapable reality of a lengthy federal prison sentence stared him right in the face. He swallowed hard, his breathing ragged and shallow. He looked around the room, desperate to find any remaining leverage to save his skin. He locked his terrified eyes with me, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. He slowly revealed that he was not as entirely stupid as the Sterling family believed he was. He confessed that during the months he spent helping his father-in-law set up the fraudulent real estate documents, he had secretly skimmed a massive fortune right off the top of their illicit operations. He reached into his ruined suit jacket and pulled out a small, encrypted cold storage drive. He announced that the drive contained a hidden cryptocurrency wallet holding over $20 million of the international crime syndicate's laundered money. He promised to give me 50% of the stolen millions right now, with absolutely no questions asked, if I just used my corporate resources to smuggle him completely out of the country tonight. The only sound in the penthouse was the ragged breathing of a man who had run out of options. I looked at my father, who turned his face toward the windows, unable to stomach his son bartering with stolen funds. I slowly turned my attention back to Marcus, forcing my expression to soften into a mask of calculating curiosity. I knew if I showed even a fraction of the disgust boiling inside my chest, he would recognize the trap and bolt. I knelt down so we were perfectly at eye level. I spoke with the smooth, detached tone of an executive negotiating a high-stakes merger. I told him $20 million was a substantial amount of leverage, but I did not execute blind transactions. I demanded he hand over the physical drive, along with every single decryption key and password required to access the hidden wallet. I explained my cybersecurity team needed to verify the absolute liquidity of the funds before I considered risking my freedom to arrange an untraceable flight. Marcus did not hesitate for a second. The sheer desperation to escape a federal prison sentence overrode his remaining survival instincts. He eagerly shoved the drive into my hands and rapidly rattled off a complex sequence of passwords, begging me to hurry because he was convinced federal agents were tracking his cell phone. I stood up, smoothly sliding the drive into my blazer pocket without breaking eye contact. I instructed him to sit on the floor and remain completely silent while I processed the digital transaction. I walked swiftly across the living space and entered my soundproof, glass-walled home office, locking the heavy door securely behind me. I bypassed my laptop's security protocols and initiated a secure video call with the lead director of my cybersecurity division. He answered on the first ring, his face illuminated by the blue glow of multiple computer monitors. I plugged the drive into my secure terminal and fed him the exact string of passwords Marcus had frantically provided moments ago. I ordered him to bypass the standard firewalls and rip into the core architecture of the cryptocurrency wallet. I wanted a complete forensic trace of every digital transaction associated with that specific account. My director's fingers flew across his keyboard in a blur of rapid motion. The intricate blockchain ledger began to violently unpack across my own screen. We watched the massive sums of money route backwards through a dizzying maze of international shell corporations and fake real estate holdings. I expected to see the bloody fingerprints of the international crime syndicate the Sterlings had been laundering cash for. Instead, my security director suddenly stopped typing. A sharp gasp escaped his lips as the final layer of digital encryption fell away, revealing the true, horrific origin point of the stolen millions. He looked up at the camera, his face pale and his voice shaking with genuine, unfiltered horror. He informed me that the funds sitting inside Marcus's hidden wallet did not originate from cartel operations or illicit overseas smuggling rings. He pulled up the source documents on our shared screen, and my heart plummeted. Marcus had not just been skimming money off the top of his wealthy father-in-law's illegal empire. He had systematically hacked into the private financial servers of my father's legitimate commercial real estate company. Over the course of 3 deceptive years, my own brother had slowly drained the private company-matched retirement accounts of Winston's longest-serving, most loyal employees. He stole the life savings of working-class people. He robbed the janitors who had cleaned our office buildings for 2 decades. He stole the pensions of the maintenance workers, the assistants, and the receptionists who watched us grow up. These were hard-working people who trusted my father with their financial futures, and Marcus had maliciously siphoned away their security to fund his luxury sports cars and his superficial lifestyle with Eleanor. The sheer malice required to steal from innocent, vulnerable people who considered our family to be their protectors was beyond basic criminal behavior. It was an act of pure, unforgivable evil. A sickening wave of nausea washed over me as the full magnitude of his monstrous betrayal finally crystallized in my mind. I closed my laptop with a sharp, definitive snap, feeling a new, dangerous level of wrath settle deep into my bones. I took a slow, measured breath, forcing my features back into an impenetrable mask of absolute calm before unlocking the glass office doors. I walked back into the main living room, where Marcus was still sitting pathetically on the floor, chewing his fingernails as he waited for his supposed salvation. I looked down at him and offered a tight, emotionless smile. I informed him that my cybersecurity team had successfully bypassed the firewall and fully verified the immense liquidity of his stolen funds. I told him we had a confirmed, ironclad deal. Marcus let out a pathetic sob of relief, burying his face in his dirty hands as he profusely thanked me for saving his life. I turned around and picked up a high-end fountain pen from the marble kitchen island. I grabbed a small piece of heavy embossed stationery and quickly jotted down an exact remote address. I walked back over and handed the crisp piece of paper to my weeping brother. I lied to his face, telling him I had just utilized my corporate connections to arrange an untraceable helicopter that was waiting to fly him off the grid. I instructed him to use the service elevator to avoid the lobby cameras and explicitly ordered him to travel on foot to the abandoned industrial airfield listed on the paper. I told him the chopper would be waiting on the broken tarmac with its engines running. Marcus stumbled through the rusted chain-link fence of the abandoned industrial airfield, his breathing ragged and echoing in the dead silence of the night. He clutched the heavy leather suitcase against his chest like a physical shield, convinced it held his ultimate salvation. He scanned the cracked, weed-choked tarmac, desperately searching for the sleek silhouette of a private helicopter. He expected to hear the deafening, rhythmic thwack of rotor blades cutting through the humid Atlanta air. He fully believed I had honored our twisted bargain, assuming my corporate resources were actively paving his golden road to an untraceable paradise. He broke into a frantic sprint when he saw a vague, dark shape resting near the dilapidated hangars. He shouted into the darkness, begging the imaginary pilot to start the engines because the federal authorities were quickly closing in. The dark shape did not belong to a helicopter. It was an armored tactical vehicle. Before Marcus could even process the horrific reality of his surroundings, a dozen blinding, high-intensity floodlights violently snapped on, bathing the entire broken runway in a harsh, inescapable white glare. He threw his hands up to shield his eyes, dropping his expensive suitcase onto the shattered concrete. The booming voice of a federal agent echoed through a heavy megaphone, commanding my brother to drop to his knees and lace his fingers behind his head. Dozens of heavily armed agents swarmed from the shadows of the rusted hangars, their weapons drawn and their laser sights locked directly onto his chest. Marcus fell to the ground, scraping his knees against the jagged rocks. He screamed my name into the blinding light, his voice cracking with absolute pathetic terror as he finally realized I had never intended to save him. I had purposefully marched him directly into the waiting jaws of the federal government. The agents aggressively slammed him onto the unforgiving tarmac, forcefully clicking heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists and officially ending the arrogant reign of my family's golden child. Miles away, inside the sterile, windowless walls of the federal building, Eleanor was putting on the most spectacular performance of her entire life. She sat shivering in a hard metal chair inside a cold interrogation room, clutching a flimsy paper cup of water with trembling hands. A seasoned federal prosecutor sat across the metal table, silently watching the blonde heiress desperately try to manipulate her way out of a decades-long prison sentence. Eleanor weaponized every single tear she could muster. She painted herself as the ultimate tragic victim of a deeply abusive marriage. She looked the prosecutor dead in the eye and spun a wildly racist, highly calculated narrative. She claimed that Marcus was a violently controlling, aggressive black man who terrified her on a daily basis. She wept loudly, insisting that she was completely isolated from her wealthy family and physically forced into participating in the elaborate real estate fraud under the strict threat of domestic violence. Eleanor sobbed into her hands, wiping away fake tears as she desperately tried to shift the entire burden of the criminal enterprise onto the very husband she had manipulated. She swore she knew absolutely nothing about the international crime syndicate or the massive money laundering operation until Marcus forced her to comply. She claimed my brother had ruthlessly coerced her into filing the false police report against my father by threatening to take her children away forever. She leaned across the metal table, batting her tear-stained eyelashes, and offered the federal government a supposedly irresistible deal. She promised to testify fully and completely against Marcus in open court. She vowed to hand over every single piece of financial evidence required to lock my brother away for the rest of his natural life. All she asked for in return was absolute, total immunity from prosecution, arguing that an innocent, terrified housewife did not deserve to be punished for the sins of her dangerous husband. The federal prosecutor listened to her entire sickening monologue without interrupting a single time. He did not offer her a comforting smile or a tissue to dry her fabricated tears. He simply reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a small, highly advanced digital audio recorder. It was the exact same recording device my cybersecurity team had securely delivered to his private office less than an hour ago. The prosecutor placed the silver device squarely in the center of the metal table, right next to Eleanor's trembling hands. He looked at the arrogant woman who thought her old money status made her completely untouchable, and he pressed the bright green playback button. The crystal-clear audio filled the silent interrogation room. It was not the voice of a terrified, abused housewife being forced into a criminal conspiracy. It was Eleanor's own voice, dripping with malicious, unhinged authority. The recording captured her vividly and explicitly instructing Marcus on exactly how to forge Winston's signature on the commercial land transfer documents. The audio laid bare her brilliant, deeply sinister plan to deliberately provoke my father so she could fake an assault and trigger the emergency conservatorship. The prosecutor watched Eleanor's entire body freeze as her own recorded voice casually mocked my father's mental state and gleefully calculated the exact profit margins of laundering the cartel's dirty cash through the stolen real estate. She was not a victim. She was the absolute mastermind. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, watching the color completely drain from her shocked face as the recording continued playing. He smoothly informed her that the federal government did not offer immunity deals to the primary architects of international money laundering operations. He told her she was going to spend the rest of her miserable life rotting inside a maximum security prison cell. Eleanor finally realized that her arrogant, racist lies had failed, and she began to sob tears of genuine, inescapable terror as she stared at the silver device sitting on the cold metal table. Her game ended. The absolute truth about that damning piece of audio stretched back exactly 3 weeks before the disastrous night at the police precinct. Marcus had always enthusiastically played the role of the eager, compliant son-in-law. But hiding beneath his designer suits and rehearsed smiles lay a deep, festering pit of sheer paranoia. He knew exactly how Harrison and Victoria Sterling viewed him. To them, he was never family. He was merely a convenient, disposable pawn who happened to share blood with the man whose land they desperately needed. Terrified that his wealthy white in-laws would eventually use his massive gambling debts to frame him for their international money laundering operation, my brother took drastic measures to protect his own skin. He purchased highly sensitive, voice-activated recording devices from a covert surveillance supplier. He spent hours meticulously hiding the tiny microphones inside the air conditioning vents and behind the crown molding of his own master bedroom in the Buckhead mansion. He wanted an insurance policy. He wanted undeniable proof that his elegant, high society wife was the true mastermind pulling the strings in the dark. Marcus succeeded in capturing hours of pristine, crystal-clear audio. He recorded Eleanor pacing across their bedroom floor, explicitly detailing her sinister plan to agitate our father into a defensive reaction so she could fake a brutal assault. He captured her cold, calculating laughter as she outlined how much cartel cash they could successfully wash through the commercial land trust once Winston was locked inside a psychiatric ward. Marcus backed up all these heavily encrypted audio files onto his personal, password-protected cloud drive, foolishly believing his digital vault was entirely impenetrable. He completely forgot that he shared blood with a woman who employed some of the most ruthless cybersecurity experts in the global financial sector. Exactly 2 weeks ago, I had instructed my elite tech team to systematically dismantle my brother's digital footprint. It took my lead engineer less than 48 hours to completely shatter Marcus's firewall. When my team handed me the decrypted audio files, I did not confront him. I bypassed the corrupt local authorities entirely and hand-delivered the flash drive directly to the highest-ranking federal prosecutor in the state of Georgia. Back inside the freezing interrogation room, the devastating reality of her situation violently crashed down onto Eleanor's shoulders. The federal prosecutor paused the recording, letting the suffocating silence swallow her pathetic sobs. She stared blankly at the metal table, her mind frantically connecting the pieces of her catastrophic downfall. She finally understood that the very husband she had manipulated, mocked, and planned to abandon had secretly bugged their marital bed to build a criminal case against her. She also realized that my calculated silence over the past few weeks was never a sign of weakness or defeat. It was the strategic patience of a corporate predator calmly waiting for her prey to walk directly into an inescapable steel trap. Her own husband's intense, cowardly paranoia, combined with my relentless, unforgiving technical brilliance, had permanently sealed her fate. She had no leverage left to trade. She had no influential family members to call because they were currently being booked in adjacent interrogation rooms. She was absolutely nothing but a common criminal facing a massive federal indictment. Two armed federal marshals stepped into the small room, aggressively pulling Eleanor up from the hard metal chair. They informed her that her initial processing was complete and she was being transferred to the main holding facility to await her formal arraignment. Her ridiculously expensive designer heels dragged against the linoleum floor as the marshals escorted her down the brightly lit, sterile, freezing corridors of the federal building. She looked completely and utterly hollowed out, a broken shell of the arrogant woman who had sneered at me in the country club just a few hours ago. Her wrists were bound tightly in heavy steel handcuffs, restricting her movements as they marched her toward the central processing hub. The hallway was a chaotic maze of shouting agents, ringing telephones and blaring alarms, a stark contrast to the quiet, luxurious life she had ruthlessly fought to preserve for herself. She kept her blonde head down, desperately trying to hide her tear-stained face from the passing federal employees who watched her walk by in total disgrace. The harsh, unforgiving reality of her upcoming, lengthy prison sentence weighed heavily on her chest, making it physically difficult for her to breathe normally. As the marshals guided Eleanor around a sharp corner near the fingerprinting station, they abruptly halted. Coming directly toward them, escorted by 3 federal agents, was Marcus. My brother looked absolutely terrified, his tailored suit completely ruined from being tackled onto the abandoned airfield tarmac. Eleanor stopped dead in her tracks, locking eyes with the man who had secretly recorded her most sinister confessions. The realization of his ultimate betrayal ignited a sudden, explosive surge of violent adrenaline inside her. She let out a blood-curdling, unhinged scream that echoed over the noise of the busy precinct. She aggressively jerked her body away from the marshals and launched herself directly at Marcus. She tackled him against the concrete wall, completely ignoring the heavy handcuffs cutting into her own wrists. She screamed that he was a pathetic, cowardly traitor who had ruined her life forever. She violently kicked his shins and desperately tried to claw at his face with her restricted hands, loudly spitting venomous curses and aggressively blaming his sheer, unadulterated stupidity for their total, inescapable destruction. Marcus fought back frantically against her assault, wildly screaming that she was a deeply manipulative monster who rightfully deserved to rot in a federal prison cell for trying to leave him to face the ruthless cartel completely alone. The vicious, screaming physical altercation between the 2 former conspirators required 6 heavily armed federal agents to aggressively pull them apart as they violently dragged each other down into absolute, permanent ruin while the entire precinct watched them. While Marcus and Eleanor remained securely locked inside federal holding cells to await their criminal trials, I finally drove my father back to his primary estate in Buckhead. The heavy iron gates of the property stood wide open, a lingering scar from the forceful takeover my brother had orchestrated just days ago. I parked my armored vehicle on the circular driveway and gently helped my father out of the passenger seat. The massive Georgian mansion looked completely silent and undisturbed from the outside, bathed in the soft golden light of the early afternoon sun. My private security team had already swept the perimeter to ensure no lingering trespassers or paparazzi remained on the grounds. Winston took a slow, deep breath of the crisp autumn air, seemingly eager to step back into the sanctuary he had built with his own 2 hands over 40 grueling years. He pulled his original brass key from his coat pocket and unlocked the heavy mahogany front doors. He pushed them open, expecting to find the familiar, comforting warmth of his lifelong home. Instead, a chilling wave of destruction greeted us. Eleanor had not simply packed her designer bags and left when she realized the federal authorities were closing in. She had thrown a vicious, calculated tantrum meant to inflict maximum emotional damage on her way out. The grand foyer was an absolute disaster zone of shattered crystal and ruined memories. The antique vases my late mother had collected were smashed into thousands of jagged pieces across the imported marble floor. Heavy velvet curtains had been violently ripped from their brass rods and left in tangled heaps. As we walked further into the sprawling, formal living room, the sheer scale of Eleanor's malicious rage became painfully clear. She had taken a box cutter to the custom leather sofas, leaving deep, ragged slashes across the upholstery. Family portraits that had hung proudly above the stone fireplace were torn from the walls, their glass frames stomped into the Persian rugs. She had deliberately targeted the photographs featuring me and my father, scratching out our faces with a sharp blade, while leaving the pictures of Marcus entirely untouched. It was a disgusting physical manifestation of the racial and familial hatred she had harbored in her heart for years. Winston stopped dead in the center of the ruined living room, staring at a deeply slashed portrait of our family from my high school graduation. His broad shoulders suddenly slumped forward, completely stripped of the fierce protective energy he had displayed at the courthouse. He did not yell or curse at the destruction. He simply sank to his knees amidst the broken glass and torn canvas. A low, agonizing sob escaped his chest, echoing terribly through the vandalized mansion. He was not mourning the loss of his expensive furniture or his irreplaceable antiques. He was mourning the absolute, irreversible death of the son he thought he knew. He wept for the decades of unconditional love and endless financial support he had poured into a boy who ultimately allowed a cruel, racist woman to desecrate our family legacy. I watched my father break down, his calloused hands covering his tear-stained face as the crushing reality of Marcus's ultimate betrayal shattered his remaining strength. In that devastating moment, the final remnants of my childhood completely dissolved. I realized that my father could no longer carry the heavy burden of leading our family alone. I walked across the ruined room and knelt beside him on the debris-covered floor. I did not offer hollow platitudes or promise him that everything would miraculously go back to normal. I wrapped my arms tightly around his shaking shoulders and allowed him to grieve the profound loss of his only son. After several minutes, I gently helped him stand back up and guided him away from the wreckage. I led him into the unblemished sunroom at the back of the house, seating him in a comfortable wicker chair overlooking the peaceful garden. I poured him a glass of water and told him to rest. I then pulled out my secure phone and completely took charge of the situation. I contacted my elite corporate restoration team, ordering a dozen professional cleaners, carpenters, and security technicians to the estate immediately. I directed my security detail to thoroughly document every single piece of vandalism for the federal prosecutor, ensuring Eleanor would face additional charges for the malicious destruction of property. I moved through the chaotic mansion with absolute unwavering authority, barking orders, and managing the crisis with the exact same ruthless efficiency I used to dismantle rival corporations. I officially stepped into my rightful role as the true protector and absolute leader of the Washington family. By the late evening, the shattered glass had been completely swept away, the ruined furniture removed, and the mansion felt peaceful once again. I quietly sat across from my father at the polished kitchen island, sharing a quiet, restorative dinner we had ordered from his favorite local restaurant. The immediate danger had finally passed, and the arrogant, malicious villains who ruthlessly tried to destroy us were finally facing their ultimate, inescapable justice inside a federal courthouse. I took a sip of my sparkling water, feeling a profound sense of closure settling into my bones. Before I could even finish my drink, the secure corporate tablet resting on the counter began emitting a shrill, piercing alarm. The glowing screen rapidly flashed bright red, with a top-tier maximum priority notification directly from my head of global financial intelligence. I quickly swiped the sleek screen open, my blood running instantly cold as I meticulously read the highly confidential, urgent briefing. A massive, notoriously aggressive rival investment firm located in New York had been closely monitoring the relentless public media circus surrounding my family's recent scandal. Sensing a rare, highly profitable moment of vulnerability and distraction, they had just officially launched a hostile, billion-dollar corporate takeover bid, explicitly targeting Winston's $50 million commercial land trust. The hostile bid notification glaring on my tablet screen was a blatant, highly aggressive declaration of corporate war. I knew immediately that this was not a random business maneuver, but a highly calculated assault designed to exploit our current family trauma. Preston Caldwell, the notoriously ruthless chief executive officer of Apex Financial in New York, had officially smelled blood in the water. He erroneously assumed that the spectacular, highly publicized federal arrests of my brother and his wealthy in-laws had left our family entirely crippled and deeply distracted. Less than 48 hours after I had successfully reclaimed my father's ransacked estate, I walked into the sleek, glass-walled boardroom of Vanguard Capital. Preston was already sitting at the head of my massive mahogany conference table, acting as though he already owned the entire building. He was flanked by 4 aggressive corporate lawyers who looked ready to dissect my family's remaining assets. Preston offered a condescending, predatory smile as I took my seat directly across from him. He casually leaned back in his leather chair, tossing a thick, aggressively structured contract onto the polished wood. He did not offer any basic professional pleasantries. Instead, he immediately weaponized the devastating media circus currently surrounding my family. He loudly noted that the federal money laundering scandal involving Marcus had severely tainted the public reputation of Winston's commercial land trust. Preston arrogantly declared that the land was now an incredibly toxic, highly radioactive asset that no legitimate developer would ever touch. He claimed he was doing me a massive favor by taking the contaminated property off my hands, offering a steep, insulting discount of $10 million for a trust officially valued at $50 million. I did not flinch at his outrageously low offer, or his blatant disrespect toward my family's vulnerable situation. I calmly opened my leather portfolio, extracting my own meticulously organized stack of financial documents. I looked directly into Preston's smug eyes and informed him that he had severely miscalculated his current corporate leverage. He scoffed, pointing a manicured finger at the television screens in my own boardroom, which were currently broadcasting live coverage of Eleanor's federal indictment. He aggressively insisted that my family was drowning in an inescapable public relations nightmare, and I simply did not have the capital or the mental bandwidth to fight a prolonged legal battle against a Wall Street titan. I smiled coldly, leaning forward to rest my elbows on the polished mahogany. I methodically began to tear his entire financial strategy into absolute, irreparable shreds. Drawing upon my extensive expertise in high stakes mergers and acquisitions, I cited specific legal precedents that completely invalidated his hostile takeover parameters. I pointed out three glaring regulatory loopholes in his aggressively drafted contract that would trigger immediate investigations by the Securities and Exchange Commission if he dared to proceed. I systematically neutralized every single legal and financial attack his elite legal team tried to launch across the table. I humiliated his highly paid attorneys by reciting the exact corporate bylaws they had foolishly attempted to bypass in their desperate rush to steal my father's land. Preston's arrogant demeanor rapidly dissolved into genuine simmering frustration as he realized his aggressive ambush was completely falling apart. He slammed his fist against the heavy table, dropping the calm corporate facade entirely. He angrily shouted that Vanguard Capital was far too small to survive the massive sustained economic assault he was prepared to unleash. He threatened to deliberately flood the market with negative speculation, promising to personally ensure that every major banking institution in the country viewed my father's commercial trust as an untouchable liability. He confidently boasted that Apex Financial possessed billions of dollars in liquid reserves, and he would gladly bleed my firm dry in endless civil litigation just to teach me a lesson in corporate hierarchy. His lawyers nodded vigorously, clearly accustomed to bullying smaller firms into immediate submission through sheer financial exhaustion. I listened to his loud, pathetic temper tantrum without a single trace of emotion on my face. I calmly closed my leather portfolio and took a slow, deliberate sip from my glass of ice water. I let his empty, desperate threats hang in the silent boardroom, completely stripping away his perceived authority. I smoothly informed Preston that his aggressive threats of financial ruin were entirely meaningless because I had anticipated his hostile maneuvers weeks before he even drafted his pathetic offer. I explained that while he was busy watching the news coverage of my brother's arrest, I had been executing the most aggressive financial strategy of my entire career. I reached into my tailored blazer and pulled out a single folded sheet of corporate stationery. I slid the crisp document across the polished mahogany table, stopping it exactly an inch away from Preston's trembling hands. I instructed him to read the verified financial disclosures printed on the page. Preston grabbed the document, his eyes scanning the text as the color drained from his face. I calmly explained that when I seized the heavily leveraged assets of the Sterling family during their spectacular downfall, I did not just let those vast resources sit idle in a holding account. I had immediately and ruthlessly liquidated every single one of their commercial properties, luxury vehicles, and offshore trust funds. I generated an absolute mountain of untraceable liquid cash. I watched Preston's jaw drop open as the reality of his situation clicked in his arrogant mind. I leaned across the massive conference table and delivered my ultimate, devastating checkmate. I loudly announced that I had not simply defended my father's commercial land trust from his pathetic hostile takeover. I revealed that I had quietly used the massive liquidated Sterling fortune to secretly buy up a 60% majority shareholder stake in Apex Financial over the last 48 hours. I smiled brightly at the completely paralyzed man and informed him that I now owned his entire corporate empire and he was officially fired. I left Preston Caldwell sitting paralyzed in that glass-walled boardroom, clutching the financial documents that officially ended his corporate reign. The swift, brutal execution of his hostile takeover attempt sent shockwaves through Wall Street, completely solidifying Vanguard Capital as an untouchable powerhouse. However, controlling the closed-door boardrooms of Wall Street was only half the battle. The media circus surrounding the Sterling family's catastrophic federal raid and my brother's highly publicized arrest had ignited a wildfire of vicious rumors across global financial networks. Tabloids and elite gossip columns were desperately trying to spin a narrative that painted the Sterlings as tragic victims of a complex corporate misunderstanding, while subtly implying that my father Winston was still a mentally unstable liability who had somehow triggered the entire collapse. I was not going to allow racist old money apologists to rewrite the narrative. It was time to permanently rip the curtain down. 48 hours after acquiring Apex Financial, I orchestrated the largest, most heavily covered global press conference in the history of Atlanta's financial district. We did not hold it in a cramped anonymous hotel conference room. I hosted it directly on the sweeping, marble-lined steps of Vanguard Capital's towering global headquarters. Over 100 journalists from every major international news syndicate, Bloomberg, Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, and international broadcast networks were aggressively packed behind heavy velvet ropes, their camera lenses flashing like a continuous blinding lightning storm. News helicopters chopped through the crisp afternoon air overhead, broadcasting the event live to millions of viewers worldwide. I walked out through the heavy glass doors wearing a razor-sharp, midnight blue tailored suit that projected absolute impenetrable authority. I did not walk alone. My father Winston walked proudly by my side, his posture immaculate and his expression radiating a quiet, unbreakable dignity. Flanking us were Charles Kensington and my elite legal team, creating an imposing physical wall of corporate power. I stepped up to the podium, which bristled with dozens of microphones, and looked out over the sea of hungry reporters. The chaotic shouting and frantic questions instantly died down as I gripped the edges of the podium, commanding the absolute silence of the plaza without uttering a single word. "Good afternoon," I began, my voice carrying a crisp, icy calm that echoed flawlessly through the massive outdoor speakers. For the past 3 weeks, the global media has speculated wildly about the sudden insolvency of Sterling Holdings, the arrest of Harrison and Eleanor Sterling, and the tragic involvement of my own brother, Marcus Washington. Today, the speculation permanently ends. Vanguard Capital is officially releasing a fully declassified, meticulously documented forensic dossier to every single news agency present. Charles Kensington stepped forward sharply, handing out thick, securely bound flash drives to the frantic front row of journalists. I locked my eyes onto the main broadcast cameras, ensuring my words would pierce directly into the living rooms of the elite families who had dared to doubt us. The narrative being spun by Sterling apologists is that this was a simple real estate deal gone wrong. That is a fabricated, malicious lie, I declared loudly, the sheer force of my conviction ringing across the plaza. The Sterlings did not want to develop a neighborhood. As the forensic evidence will prove, Harrison and Eleanor Sterling were the primary architects of a massive, highly illegal international money laundering syndicate. They desperately needed my father's $50 million commercial land trust to wash hundreds of millions of dollars in illicit cartel funds through fraudulent construction contracts. A collective audible gasp rippled through the press corps. The rapid clicking of camera shutters intensified into a deafening roar. I did not pause to let them recover. But what is truly abhorrent, I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous, razor-sharp register, is the exact method they utilized to attempt this theft. The Sterlings, aided by a deeply compromised psychiatrist and my own estranged brother, deliberately weaponized the mental health and judicial systems against an innocent, hard-working black man. They filed fraudulent assault charges and orchestrated a fake emergency psychiatric conservatorship simply because they knew the historical vulnerabilities of minorities within those specific systems. They tried to strip Winston Washington of his human rights, his dignity, and his freedom, all to line their own blood-soaked pockets. A prominent financial reporter from a notoriously conservative network shouted over the crowd, aggressively trying to defend the old money establishment. Miss Washington, are you suggesting that Harrison Sterling, a pillar of the Buckhead community for 4 decades, faked a violent assault? Your own brother signed the medical paperwork. I snapped my gaze directly onto the hostile reporter, pinning him in place with a look of absolute predatory disdain. My brother Marcus is a compromised, heavily indebted gambling addict who sold his own father's life to avoid having his legs broken by underground loan sharks. And yes, I am absolutely confirming that Eleanor Sterling staged the entire physical assault. I gestured to the massive digital screens we had erected behind the podium. In exactly 5 minutes, Vanguard Capital will publicly release the encrypted audio recordings of Eleanor Sterling, explicitly detailing her sinister plan to provoke my father, fake a domestic violence incident, and launder cartel cash. The so-called pillar of your elite community is a federally indicted fraudster who is currently sitting in a concrete holding cell where she belongs. The hostile reporter instantly fell silent, his face turning entirely pale as the undeniable weight of my statement crushed his pathetic defense. I turned my attention back to the broader audience, placing a gentle, protective hand on my father's shoulder. Winston Washington is not a victim, and he is certainly not legally incompetent, I stated proudly, letting the genuine love and fierce loyalty from my father bleed into my authoritative tone. He is a brilliant, resilient pioneer who built a generational legacy with his own bare hands, navigating a cutthroat industry designed to keep men like him out. He survived the blatant racism of the old money elite, and he survived the horrific betrayal of his own flesh and blood. Today, all fraudulent conservatorships have been completely nullified by the federal courts. Vanguard Capital has legally seized the entirety of the Sterling family's liquidated assets, and we have fully restored my father's $50 million trust to its rightful owner. I leaned closely into the microphones, delivering the final, devastating broadcast to any remaining rivals watching around the globe. Let this serve as an absolute, permanent warning to anyone who believes their wealth, their privilege, or their family name makes them untouchable. If you attempt to steal from the Washington family, if you attempt to weaponize the law against the vulnerable, we will not just defeat you in court. We will systematically dismantle your entire empire. We will buy your debts, and we will leave you with absolutely nothing. I stepped away from the podium amidst a chaotic explosion of shouted questions and blinding camera flashes. I did not answer a single follow-up. I took my father's arm, and together, surrounded by our loyal team, we walked back through the heavy glass doors of Vanguard Capital, leaving the shattered, permanently ruined legacy of the Sterling family bleeding out on the marble steps for the whole world to see. But professional victories, no matter how lucrative, could never compare to the profound, visceral satisfaction of witnessing absolute justice inside a federal courtroom. 3 months after the dramatic arrests on the abandoned airfield, the highly anticipated sentencing hearing for my brother and the Sterling family finally arrived. The federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta was a fortress of polished oak and heavy marble packed shoulder to shoulder with aggressive reporters, curious socialites, and weary legal teams. My father, Winston, sat firmly beside me in the front row of the gallery, wearing a custom-tailored suit and an expression of unyielding dignity. Across the aisle, sitting at the heavy wooden defense tables, were the people who had maliciously conspired to steal his life, his freedom, and his legacy. Harrison and Victoria Sterling looked completely diminished, their arrogant postures broken under the crushing weight of their impending incarceration. Marcus sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the floor, absolutely terrified of the consequences he could no longer escape. And then there was Eleanor, my manipulative sister-in-law, who still foolishly believed she could charm her way out of a federal indictment. She had spent the last few weeks attempting to negotiate several favorable plea deals, all of which were flatly rejected by the prosecutors. The presiding federal judge, a stern, deeply respected woman with decades of experience on the bench, called the courtroom to order and asked if any of the defendants wished to make a final statement before sentencing. Eleanor immediately seized the opportunity. She practically leapt from her chair, approaching the podium with her hands clasped tightly together in a perfectly calculated display of sheer desperation. She did not wear her usual designer brands or expensive diamonds. She dressed in a modest, conservative suit, deliberately attempting to project the image of a naive, fragile housewife. Eleanor looked up at the judge, forcing thick, wet tears to well in her eyes, as her voice trembled with rehearsed emotion. She sobbed openly, begging the court for absolute leniency for the sake of her innocent young children. She painted a pathetic, entirely fabricated picture of a woman who was brutally coerced into a massive criminal conspiracy by an abusive, controlling husband and a dominant, terrifying father. She wept into the microphone, claiming she never understood the complex financial documents she was forced to sign, and swore she never truly intended to harm my father. She begged the judge to show mercy on a desperate mother who was simply trying to keep her family together under impossible, terrifying circumstances. She repeatedly emphasized her wholesome, highly privileged upbringing, as if it somehow excused her from basic human decency. The judge listened to Eleanor's theatrical performance without showing a single trace of sympathy. When Eleanor finally retreated to her seat, wiping away her fake tears with a tissue, the judge turned her attention to the gallery and asked if the victims wished to address the court. I stood up, smoothly adjusting the lapel of my tailored blazer, and walked purposefully toward the polished wooden podium. I did not carry any written notes, and I certainly did not shed any tears. I looked directly at the judge, my voice echoing with a fierce, unwavering authority that commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. I delivered a devastating, articulate victim impact statement on behalf of my father. I systematically dismantled every single lie Eleanor had just spoken, pointing to the undeniable audio recordings that proved she was the ruthless, calculating mastermind of the entire operation. I did not just expose her financial greed. I explicitly outlined the sheer disgusting malice and the dark underlying racial dynamics of their horrific scheme. I loudly reminded the court how this wealthy, privileged white family deliberately weaponized the police department and the deeply flawed psychiatric system against an innocent, hard-working black man. They knew exactly how the system historically treated men who looked like my father, and they maliciously exploited those systemic prejudices to silence him, discredit him, and steal his generational wealth for their own illicit cartel operations. I detailed the profound, lingering emotional trauma they deliberately inflicted on a man who had only ever shown them immense generosity and love. I turned my gaze away from the judge and looked directly at Harrison Victoria Marcus and Eleanor. I told the silent courtroom that these defendants did not commit a crime of desperation or naivete. They committed a crime of pure, unadulterated arrogance, believing their money and their social status made them completely immune to the laws that governed everyone else. I finished my statement by demanding that the court hold them to the absolute highest standard of justice, ensuring they could never again use power to destroy another innocent life. I walked back to my seat, taking my father's hand as the judge looked down at the trembling defendants with an expression of profound, unfiltered disgust. She adjusted her microphone and stated that, in all her years on the federal bench, she had rarely encountered a conspiracy so deeply rooted in pure malice, manipulation, and sheer entitlement. She explicitly condemned Eleanor's pathetic attempt to maliciously use her young children as a defensive shield for her own horrific crimes. The judge raised her heavy wooden gavel high and delivered the ultimate devastating hook that permanently and completely ended the Sterling Empire. She officially handed down the absolute maximum prison sentences for every single defendant, without any possibility of early parole. She then ordered full, immediate financial restitution, officially and permanently stripping the Sterlings of whatever hidden generational wealth they had left to compensate the state, ensuring they would spend the rest of their miserable lives rotting in federal prison, completely and utterly bankrupt. Exactly 6 months later, the chaotic dust of the greatest corporate scandal in Atlanta history had finally settled into a permanent, undeniable reality. Deep inside the suffocating, freezing concrete walls of a highly guarded maximum security federal penitentiary, Eleanor was aggressively learning the true meaning of grueling manual labor. The former Buckhead heiress, who once threw furious tantrums if her imported champagne was poured at the wrong temperature, now spent 14 agonizing hours a day working inside the sweltering, windowless prison laundry room. Her perfectly manicured hands were permanently blistered, covered in harsh chemical burns from violently scrubbing the soiled jumpsuits of thousands of other inmates. Her expensive designer wardrobe had been completely replaced by a rough, oversized orange uniform that hung awkwardly off her exhausted frame. She no longer possessed a single ounce of her elite privilege, and the influential politicians her father used to casually bribe had aggressively erased her entire family from their social registries. She was absolutely nothing more than a federal inmate carrying a heavy permanent criminal record, forced to quietly obey the strict commands of the very working-class guards she used to cruelly mock. 300 miles away, in a separate high-security federal facility, my brother Marcus was experiencing his own spectacular, irreversible downfall. The arrogant man who was practically handed the keys to our family kingdom was currently pushing a filthy, waterlogged mop across the sticky linoleum floor of the prison cafeteria. He was completely stripped of his untouchable golden boy status. There were no wealthy parents to blindly write a massive check to cover his egregious mistakes, and there was no powerful corporate title to hide his pathetic incompetence. He spent his long, miserable days wiping up spilled food and scrubbing grimy cafeteria tables, constantly subjected to the aggressive, humiliating taunts of the hardened criminals surrounding him. He had eagerly tried to sell his own father into a psychiatric nightmare just to maintain his fake, glamorous lifestyle. Now, his entire existence was confined to a tiny, freezing cell with a stainless steel toilet and absolutely zero hope for an early release. The generational wealth he had desperately tried to steal had completely vanished, leaving him to rot in absolute and utter obscurity, while the world quickly forgot his name. Far away from the grim reality of federal prison, the night sky over downtown Atlanta was brilliantly illuminated by sweeping spotlights. My father and I were proudly hosting a massive, breathtakingly luxurious gala on the exact same $50 million commercial land trust that Marcus and the Sterlings had so ruthlessly tried to steal. We had successfully transformed the coveted, sprawling property into a stunning architectural masterpiece of modern glass and reinforced steel. Dozens of highly influential politicians, wealthy corporate titans, and respected community leaders walked gracefully across the grand entrance, sipping expensive vintage champagne under towering crystal chandeliers. I wore a custom-tailored emerald green evening gown that radiated absolute, undeniable power, standing shoulder to shoulder with my father at the center of the grand ballroom. Winston looked incredibly vibrant and remarkably strong, fully recovered from the horrific emotional trauma inflicted by his only son. He smiled warmly at the prominent guests, his posture perfectly straight as he greeted the very same people who had once doubted his immense resilience. We were not just celebrating a simple real estate victory tonight. We were officially launching a groundbreaking, monumental legacy that would permanently reshape the entire city. The spectacular gala was designed specifically to launch a massive, fully funded corporate incubator dedicated entirely to young, underprivileged African American entrepreneurs. We were actively utilizing the sheer magnitude of our reclaimed generational wealth to aggressively fund brilliant, overlooked innovators who lacked the elite connections required to succeed in a notoriously prejudiced financial system. The crowd fell completely silent as my father confidently walked up to the main podium, the bright stage lights reflecting off his proud, joyful face. He adjusted the microphone and delivered a powerful, deeply moving speech about the undeniable importance of true family loyalty, unrelenting hard work, and unyielding integrity. He spoke passionately about the bright future of our expanding empire, and then he turned his loving gaze directly toward me. Winston proudly introduced me to the elite audience not as a low-level clerk or a bitter outcast, but as his rightful, undisputed successor. He loudly declared to the cheering crowd that I was the true, brilliant visionary of the Washington family. The fierce protector who had single-handedly saved his life and ruthlessly dismantled the predators trying to destroy our legacy. The grand ballroom erupted into deafening, thunderous applause as I walked confidently up to the podium to join my father. I looked out over the sparkling, elegant crowd, making eye contact with my loyal cybersecurity director, my elite acquisition team, and the dedicated legal partners who had fearlessly fought by my side. They were my true allies, the formidable family I had strategically chosen and built from the ground up. I gracefully accepted a fresh flute of vintage champagne from a passing waiter and raised it high into the warm, illuminated air. I felt a profound, unmatched surge of absolute power and immense wealth coursing deeply through my veins. The vicious parasites who had arrogantly tried to drain our family dry were permanently locked away in miserable cages, while I stood completely victorious at the towering pinnacle of the global financial world. I smiled brightly, clinking my glass against my father's as the audience continued to cheer our monumental triumph. The long, grueling war was officially over, and my sweet, perfectly executed revenge was finally, beautifully complete. I looked down at the vibrant, prosperous city stretching endlessly beyond the grand ballroom windows, knowing that the Washington name would forever stand as an unbreakable symbol of resilience and strength. No one would ever underestimate us again. We had reclaimed our rightful, hard-earned throne, leaving our deceitful enemies exactly where they truly belonged for the rest of eternity.